Oberleutnant Hans Weber cut through the wire fence, convinced that he had just outsmarted his American captors. But, as he stepped into the Arizona darkness, he didn't realize he was trading a prison of steel for a prison of space. He had a map, a plan, and a head start, but he was walking straight into a trap that had no walls. He was confident, driven by duty, and completely unaware of the sheer reality awaiting him. It was a cool night in late 1944, and while the rest of the world was engulfed in the roar of artillery, the perimeter of this camp was dangerously quiet. Hans held his breath, listening to the wind hiss through the dry scrub. The silence was heavy, pressing against his ears like deep water. He was 24 years old, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over North Africa, and he had spent the last year studying his captors with the cold precision of a hawk. To Hans, the Americans were baffling. They were casual, almost lazy, treating war like a part-time job. The guard in the nearest tower wasn't scanning the fence line, he was leaning back, reading a comic book, likely one of those brightly colored fantasies about superheroes that the Americans seemed to love so much. In the German military, such negligence would be a crime punishable by court-martial. Here, it was Hans's ticket out. He belly-crawled through the gap he had created, feeling the sharp bite of gravel against his elbows. The dust of the desert floor coated his hands like flour. He moved with drilled discipline, keeping his body low, eyes locked on the dark scrubland. He was not escaping out of desperation, he was escaping out of duty. In his breast pocket sat his most valuable possession, a map carefully torn from a geography textbook in the camp library. It was a simple page showing the southwestern United States. To Hans, the logic was irrefutable. He had measured the distance with his thumb. On paper, the space between the camp and the Pacific Ocean was barely 3 inches. In Europe, that represented a few days of walking through familiar forests. He was fueled by the arrogance of an officer who believed he was intellectually superior to the men who held him captive. He cleared the lights and stood up, brushing off his modified uniform, dyed with berry juice to look like work clothes. The air smelled of sage and dry earth, a wild scent that filled his lungs with adrenaline and a strange sense of ancient time. He turned his back on the camp, looking west toward the silhouette of the mountains. He believed that if he just kept walking, he would reach the California coast within days. There, he would find a neutral ship or a U-boat. Hans adjusted his collar and began to walk, boots crunching on gravel. He felt a surge of triumph. He had defeated the wire. He had outsmarted the guards. He stepped into the darkness, confident that the hardest part was over. He was wrong. The sun rose over the Sonoran Desert, not gently, but with a sudden, blinding authority. For the first hour, the sheer beauty stunned Hans into silence. The light turned cactus spines into halos of fire and stretched shadows across the sand like fingers reaching back toward the night. It looked like a painting no human hand had ever touched, pristine and dangerously open. The alien shapes of the saguaros stood like silent sentinels, watching his intrusion with indifference. It was a landscape of brutal, uncompromising geometry and light. Hans adjusted his bag and checked his watch. He felt strong. In Europe, a man walking at a brisk pace could cross a principality in the morning. If he walked for 8 hours, he would inevitably hit a village, a river, or a farmhouse with a smoking chimney. The world he knew was dense, packed tight with centuries of civilization and marked boundaries. As he strode across the hard-packed dirt, dodging sharp cholla cactus, he applied this European logic to the American West. He fixed his eyes on a rugged purple mountain range in the distance. To his trained eye, it looked 10 miles away. A hard morning's walk. He decided he would reach the foothills by noon and rest in their shade. But the desert had a weapon Hans had never encountered: the clarity of the air. In Europe, humidity softened distances, wrapping far-off objects in a blue haze that signaled depth. Here, the air was so dry that a mountain 50 miles away looked as sharp as a rock 50 yards away. It was an optical illusion on a grand scale, a trick of light that compressed space and made the impossible look inviting. Hans walked for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, transforming into a white-hot weight that pressed down on his shoulders. He drank sparingly, proud of his discipline. He kept his eyes on the purple ridge, waiting for the details to grow larger, for the trees to resolve into shapes. But strangely, the mountain did not seem to get closer. It hovered there, stubborn and unchanged, as if he were walking on a treadmill. He paused to wipe sweat, frowning. He looked back at his footprints trailing off into the scrub, a tiny ribbon of disturbance in an ocean of silence. He had been walking at a forced march pace, yet the scenery remained maddeningly static, mocking his effort. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and violent oranges, Hans was still on the flat desert floor. The mountain range looked exactly as far away as it had for breakfast. A cold shiver hit him. He was not traversing a country. He was stepping into a void. As the stars appeared, dense and terrifyingly bright, he looked at the map in his pocket. For the first time, a small seed of doubt took root. He had underestimated his enemy, not the soldiers, but the land itself. If you're enjoying this escape story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The sound came first, a low rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the soles of his boots. Hans threw himself flat against the dusty earth of a drainage ditch, gripping a jagged rock, his only weapon. He prepared to face an armored column of American tanks hunting for him, but as the vehicles crested the rise and thundered past, Hans lowered the rock, his jaw going slack in bewilderment. It was not a military patrol. It was a parade of commerce, a relentless river of heavy steel flowing west. These were massive commercial semi-trucks, painted in bright reds and blues, chrome grills gleaming under the merciless sun. Hans watched, paralyzed. A Mack truck roared by, hauling raw timber. Then a tanker, likely milk or gasoline, followed by a box truck with a bakery logo. He could even see the drivers inside, smoking cigarettes, one arm hanging casually out the window, completely unbothered by the war. He stared, unable to comprehend the sheer wasteful scale of it. To a man who had spent 5 years in a Europe starved by blockade, the sight was incomprehensible. In Germany, gasoline was liquid gold, hoarded for panzers. Private cars ran on wood gas, horses pulled artillery because engines were dry. Yet here, the Americans were burning precious fuel to transport furniture, oranges, and soda pop. Hans watched a truck pass with the bright red script of Coca-Cola, and the realization hit harder than shrapnel. This was the enemy? A nation so awash in resources it could fight a global war and still have fuel to drive soft drinks across a desert? Hans felt a sickening drop in his stomach. Propaganda had described America as disorganized and weak. But looking at this highway, Hans saw a logistical monster. The road itself was perfect, a ribbon of smooth asphalt stretching to the horizon, maintained by machinery he couldn't even see. The temptation to stand up and wave was overwhelming. He was thirsty, blistering, and the paved road called like a siren. He could hitch a ride, but the sheer volume of traffic terrified him. Too many eyes. If he stepped onto that asphalt, he would be spotted in seconds. He realized with a sinking heart that the road was not his escape route. It was a display of the power that would crush his homeland. It was a highway of giants, indifferent to his struggle. Hans crawled backwards, scraping his elbows, retreating away from the lifeline and back into the hostility of the wilderness. He would have to take the hard way through the deep desert where the American industrial machine could not follow. The heat did not arrive like a wave. It descended like a heavy wool blanket. By noon, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees, yet the air was so aggressively dry it evaporated the sweat before Hans could feel it. It was an invisible thief, robbing his body of moisture while leaving him with a dangerous false sense of comfort. Hans checked his canteen. It was terrifyingly light. He shook it, a hollow slosh. He had rationed strictly, but discipline was no match for the biology of the Sonoran Desert. His tongue felt like dry leather. The edges of his vision blurred, turning cacti into dancing green ghosts. He knew the signs. If he did not find water, his escape would end in a quiet, dusty sleep, his body just another dried husk in the sand. The heat shimmered off the ground, distorting the flat horizon line. Then, through the heat haze, he saw a geometric shape, a windmill standing sentinel over a weathered shack. He moved toward it, expecting a mirage, but the wood remained solid. It was an abandoned homestead. He reached the windmill, hands trembling, and cranked the rusted iron pump. With a groan, a stream of water coughed out. He drank until his stomach ached, the cool liquid sweeter than wine, washing away the taste of dust and fear. Revived, Hans stepped inside the shack. It had been empty for years, but what stopped him was not the emptiness, but the leftovers. In the corner sat a cast-iron stove, rusted but intact. On a shelf, a glass jar. A wooden chair lay on its side. In Germany he left, where cities were rubble and people scavenged for nails. These were treasures. The stove was hot, a chair was fuel, yet here they were simply discarded. He stared at the stove, a surge of anger rising in his throat. The sheer wastefulness was offensive. It was a testament to a nation so rich it could walk away from iron and timber without a second thought. It made him feel small, not just as a soldier, but as a citizen of a continent scraping by on shortages. He thought of his mother in Cologne, who would have wept for such a stove. He slammed his hand against the doorframe. They didn't even need this. They had so much they could leave it to rot. He filled his canteen, the weight reassuring, and stepped back into the blinding sun. He had found water, but the psychological blow of that abandoned shack weighed heavier than his pack. The sound of his breathing was ragged, scraping against the silence like a saw. Hans pulled himself over a ledge of jagged basalt, knuckles raw. The mountain that had looked smooth from the valley was a chaotic fortress of sharp volcanic rock. His boots, fine German leather designed for cobblestones, were shredded, soles worn thin by the unforgiving geology. Every step was a war against gravity. His calves burned, his neck blistered under the relentless UV rays. But Hans drove himself upward with a mantra of military discipline. He was an officer. He would not be defeated by a pile of rocks. This ridge was the final barrier. The school atlas was vague, but it showed a mountain range separating the desert from the coast. Logic dictated that once he crested this peak, the land would slope down toward the sea. He imagined the cool Pacific breeze, the smell of salt washing away the dust. He scrambled up the final 50 feet, heart hammering from exertion and hope. He reached for a root, hauled his body over the lip, and stood up, ready to greet his freedom. He expected green valleys, coastal lights, the ocean horizon. The wind whipped his face, drying the sweat on his skin instantly. Instead, he had a nightmare. Below him, the land did not drop into civilization. It unrolled into another, even larger desert. A vast basin of brown and gray, scarred by dry riverbeds stretching endlessly. And beyond that basin, 50 miles away, stood another mountain range, higher and more formidable than this one. The scale was crushing. There was no ocean, no cities, only an endless, indifferent expanse of geology that mocked his human scale. Hans sank to his knees. He pulled the map out and stared at it. It was a lie. A simplification so extreme it was a trap. On paper, this distance was an inch. In reality, it was a week of hell. He laughed, a sound dangerously close to a sob. He had climbed the walls of his prison only to find the prison had no walls at all, only space. He sat alone on the peak, a speck in a landscape that didn't care if he lived or perished, feeling the wind whistle through the holes in his uniform. Have you ever looked at a map and thought a drive would be short, only to find yourself on the road for hours longer than you planned? Tell us your stories in the comments. The vibration started in the pebbles next to his ear, a low trembling that grew until it rattled his teeth. Hans jerked awake, hand grasping for a holster that wasn't there, fearing a tank division. But as the sound deepened into a thunderous roar, he realized it was something mundane, yet infinitely more terrifying. He crawled to the edge of a steep embankment. Below, cutting through the moonlit desert, lay iron tracks. A locomotive, a black leviathan of steam roared past, the heat hitting him in a wave of oil and coal smoke. He expected a few cars, 10, maybe 20. In Germany, trains darted between tunnels to hide from bombers, moving like frightened animals. But this train did not end. It was screaming across the desert, a blur of motion. The ground shook violently, vibrating deep inside his empty chest cavity. Hans began to count, lips moving in the dark. 1, 2, 10, 20. The cars clattered by with a rhythmic, hypnotic violence, sparks flying from the wheels. 30. They were not carrying soldiers. They were carrying the war. Flatbeds loaded with olive drab jeeps, crates of aircraft parts, massive tires stacked like poker chips. Then the tanks. Sherman tanks. Brand new, smelling of factory paint. 40, 50, 60. Hans stopped counting. In the Reich, a commander would beg for a single gearbox. Here, a single train carried enough hardware to equip a division. And it was moving openly, fearlessly, fast. It was a rolling display of industrial omnipotence. The train was a bullet. He was a statue. He realized the propaganda had lied. They weren't undisciplined cowboys. This was a factory belt that circled the world. The train continued for what felt like an hour, a river of steel refusing to run dry. By the 100th car, a physical weight settled on his chest. It wasn't fear, it was math. He was a pilot. He understood ratios. Bravery could not stop an avalanche. He watched the tanks pass, realizing for everyone destroyed in Europe, America built 10 more in a factory that never slept. When the caboose finally faded, the silence rushed back, but the desert felt different. It was the backyard of a giant. Hans laid his head down, feeling smaller than ever. The train hadn't fired a shot, but its sheer speed and volume had broken his spirit more effectively than any prison guard. Under the cold, diamond-hard light of the Milky Way, Hans knelt and unfolded the paper that had become his tormentor. It was the page stolen from the camp library, a map for American schoolchildren. He smoothed it against a rock and struck a match. The flame illuminated the jagged blue line of the Colorado River and the bold letters of Arizona and California. By his calculations, based on 3 nights of forced marching, he should have crossed the state line hours ago. He should be seeing the lights of a border town. He looked up. The match burned his fingertips. He shook it out. Darkness. Nothing. No lights, no engines, just the terrified silence of the mesquite. The stars overhead were too numerous, a dense canopy that made him feel exposed, unlike the familiar constellations of home. He felt a cold, creeping dread settle deep in his stomach. Hans struck another match, hands shaking. He looked at the scale key. In his haste, with his European frame of reference, he had glanced at it but never comprehended it. In Germany, an inch on a map might be 5 miles of dense territory. Here, that same inch swallowed 50 miles of nothingness. He had been trying to navigate an ocean using a postcard. He traced his path with a dirty finger. On the paper, his 3 days of grueling travel amounted to less than the width of his fingernail. He hadn't conquered the desert. He hadn't scratched its surface. The crushing scale of the West crashed down on him. Back home, civilization was a tight weave. Walk 4 hours. Hit a village. You were never truly alone in Europe. But this was a void. Hans stood and turned in a circle. He realized he could walk for another month and never see a soul. He could perish here, drying into leather and remain unfound for a decade. The silence, which he initially welcomed, now pressed against his eardrums. It was a silence so deep it made his heartbeat sound like a drum. He let out a dry, cracking laugh. He had spent months worrying about guards and searchlights. But standing in this geography, Hans realized the Americans didn't need guards. They didn't need wire. They had the land. The impossible size of the country was the prison. He was not being hunted, he was being ignored by a landscape too big to care if he lived or ceased to exist. The black strip of asphalt cut through the wilderness like a scar. When Hans stumbled onto the paved shoulder, he did not run. He did not scan for snipers. He walked to the center of the lane, planted his boots on the white line, and stood there. He was done. The desert had stripped him of arrogance and will. He was no longer a Luftwaffe officer, he was a man who wanted the walking to stop. A dust cloud approached, resolving into a battered Ford pickup. Hans straightened, summoning the last of his military bearing. He braced for confrontation. He expected a sheriff with a shotgun or a terrified civilian. He raised his hands, palms open. He could hear the tires crunching the gravel, popping like small firecrackers. Dust swirled around his boots as the vehicle finally stopped. The truck slowed, the engine idling with a rattle. An older man stepped out wearing overalls and a stained hat. No weapon. He just looked Hans up and down with confusion and mild pity, cigarette smoke curling from his lips. "I am Oberleutnant Hans Weber," Hans croaked, voice raspy. "I am an escaped prisoner. I surrender." He waited for the anger, the hate the propaganda promised. He expected the man to recoil. Instead, the rancher spat on the ground, his face crinkling in the sun. "Son," the man said, voice gravelly, "you look like you've been through the ringer. You want some water?" Hans blinked. The man tossed him a canteen. Hans drank so fast he choked. When he lowered it, the rancher was leaning against the hood, watching him calmly. "Get in," the man said. "I'll take you into town." The drive was surreal. Hans sat in the front seat of the enemy's vehicle, uncuffed. The hot wind roared through the cab, smelling of gasoline and dry grass. The rancher didn't ask about the war or Hitler. He complained about the rain and the cattle. To Hans, this casualness was defeating. The war, the struggle that consumed his life, was to this man merely a headline. They drove for 20 minutes before buildings appeared. Hans realized the true power of the nation he tried to escape. It wasn't tanks. It was total, unshakable security. They were so confident they could afford kindness to a man sworn to destroy them. The tires hummed on the hot asphalt, a hypnotic steady sound. Do you know someone who would appreciate this story? Share this video with a friend who loves history. The sheriff of Pinal County was not manning a machine gun nest. He was eating a ham sandwich, feet propped on a scarred desk. The office smelled of stale tobacco, floor wax, and the dust of 1,000 files. When the rancher guided Hans inside, the sheriff didn't reach for his revolver. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. He let the silence hang in the room, heavy and thick, accompanied only by the rhythmic thwump-thwump of the ceiling fan. Hans stood there, dirty and peeling, sweating under the sheriff's unbothered gaze. The silence stretched until Hans felt his knees shaking. The fan clicked rhythmically, marking the passing of anxious seconds. Finally, the rancher spoke. "Found him? Walking down Route 87, Frank." The sheriff stood up, a large man with a badge that caught the window light. "Son," he rumbled, "I'm trying to decide if I should give you a lemonade or a cell. Sit down." Hans sank into the chair, desperate. He needed to know his effort mattered. With trembling hands, he smoothed the crumpled school atlas onto the desk, smoothing out the creases he had made in the mountains. "Look," Hans said, pointing to the river. "I walked for 4 nights. I crossed the mountains. I must be close to California." 10 miles? The sheriff looked at the pathetic map. He didn't mock him. He walked to the wall and pulled down a massive, detailed tactical map of the Southwest. "Come here." Hans walked over. The sheriff tapped a tiny dot in the vast beige expanse. "You are here." Then he traced his finger west, across inches of paper representing hundreds of miles of burning sand, past mountains Hans hadn't seen, to a black line. "That is California," the sheriff said. "You didn't make it to the ocean, son. You barely made it out of the county." Hans stared. The distance he covered, an epic odyssey that broke his body, was the length of a fingernail. He was nowhere. The realization hit like a physical blow. "You would have had to walk for another 3 weeks," the sheriff added softly, "if the snakes didn't get you." Hans looked at the map, then the sheriff, and laughed, a defeated sound. He realized why the Americans were so calm. They didn't need to lock their doors. They were protected by a continent so vast no army could cross it on foot. The sheriff signaled his deputy. "Get this boy a sandwich. He's got a long wait." Hans closed his eyes, smelling the ham and the coffee. He had come to fight a nation, but he had been conquered by a map. 40 years later, an elderly Hans Weber stood in his study in a rebuilt Germany. He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a bundle tied with a faded red ribbon, the silk worn soft by time. They were not medals. They were letters postmarked from Pinal County, Arizona. He kept them in a special box made of polished cedar. For 3 decades, Hans had corresponded with Frank, the sheriff who offered him a sandwich instead of a cell. To the outside world, it seemed impossible. A Luftwaffe pilot and an American lawman, pen pals. But to Hans, it was the only thing that made sense. The desert had stripped away his ideology, leaving only a thirsty man. Frank had seen him not as a Nazi, but as a human who ran out of road. That casual decency deprogrammed Hans more than any prison camp. Hans ran his thumb over the envelopes, remembering the smell of the sagebrush that night. He often told his family, "I went looking for a way to continue the war, but in the silence of that landscape I found the peace to live my life." When Hans passed away, his family found a note tucked with the letters. It was a final testament to the lesson of the desert. The world is too big for our anger, but it is just small enough for our kindness. In the end, the man who surrendered to a map had won the only peace that mattered. If you believe that history is best told through the stories of the people who lived it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have many more lost stories to uncover, and we'd be honored to have you with us for the next journey.